Hey guys, welcome back. We are talking about 5.2 and 5.17, so we're jumping around just a little bit. This is clear cutting and sustainable forestry. So we're going to talk about the effects of clear cutting and then how to um, be more sustainable with our use of forests instead of just clear cutting them. So, our learning objectives for today are to describe the ecological and economical benefits of forests, describe the effects of clear cutting on forests, and then describe methods for mitigating human impacts on forests. So, first, let's talk a little bit about what the ecological services are, and then we'll talk about what the economical services are. We've kind of already talked about these, but this might be just a good refresher for you. So, forests, of course, serve as a habitat. So, we know that they're really large places for primary productivity and, as a result, biodiversity. Um, they aid in soil formation and retention. So we know forests can oftentimes, with the exception of tropical forests, can oftentimes have some of the most mature soil types because they have really old growth within them. And that means that there's been a lot of nutrient cycling, a lot of undisturbed nutrient cycling for very long periods of time. Additionally, you have a lot of organic matter cycling. And they're going to play a really large role in biogeochemical cycling as a result of this. They serve as a food resource, not necessarily for people, but maybe for other species. And they're also really great at removing air/water pollutants. So we know that, for instance, they remove a lot of carbon or sequester a lot of carbon from the atmosphere, as well as contribute to removing pollutants that normally would come off in runoff. So we like forests and they do a lot for us from an ecological standpoint. And then, of course, we value them even more because there are economic benefits associated with them. So the first one and probably most known is timber. So this PowerPoint is on clear cutting, and timber, of course, is generally what we're looking for during clear cutting. We use timber for all sorts of things. Building houses, building furniture, converting it into other forms of building materials that are of value to us. Forests also are good for grazing livestock. So, for instance, if you have we talked about this in the Tragedy of the Commons, but if you have livestock in a common area, forest can be an area where you can release that livestock and allow them to graze. It provides a space for shade-tolerant plants. So agriculture that tends to like to live in areas that are shadier do very well in areas that, like forests, that have a lot of large old growth trees that provide a lot of shade so that those plants can grow. Of course, we value them for ecotourism and the aesthetics that they bring. So we have things like national forests that people like to go and just enjoy because they're aesthetically pleasing. If you live near forests, it can impact your real estate values. Generally, that increases the value of your home if you're nearby some sort of aesthetically pleasing area. And then this is often an area where we do a lot of mining in, so there tends to be an economic benefit associated with that. So what is clear cutting? This is just, of course, when you cut down all of the trees in a forest. You've probably seen images like this before where just every tree has been removed. This, of course, eliminates all of the ecological and economical benefits that we just talked about. However, it is the easiest method of harvesting and tends to be the most economical for humans. We are going to discuss other methods of removing trees and using them for resources, but for right now, we'll talk just about clear cutting. And the main reason why we do it is just because it's the easiest. We can go in with big machinery, take everything out, and leave and not have to worry about anything else. Generally, after like a mass clear cutting, we will reseed. But the issue with that, of course, is that all of the trees that we reseed with are going to be the exact same age. So you won't have the shade tolerant species that are able to survive. You have to hope that those trees do well in full sunlight, etc. So you're basically starting with secondary succession again. So what are some impacts of clear cutting on both terrestrial land and the atmosphere? So the most obvious one, of course, is a loss of habitat/biodiversity. With clear cutting, you're eliminating spaces for things to live and survive, and then you're probably eliminating some of the biodiversity itself with the trees being removed. You also see a loss of economic opportunity. So any type of economic value that was being brought on by by those trees or by that forest is no longer usable. So for instance, ecotourism or the aesthetic value that brought in ecotourism, that would probably halt. You of course lose actual plant biomass. This is largely problematic because trees store or sequester carbon dioxide. So an actual loss of plant biomass means less sequestering. It also means less photosynthesis. So if there's less photosynthesis, then that also means there's less carbon sequestering and less carbon storage. We lose food sources. This can be again for humans or other species. And then of course aesthetically, this is just not as pleasing to look at. What we do see an increase of with clear cutting is soil erosion, which can lead to things like desertification. So soil erosion becomes more problematic as it becomes more susceptible to things like wind erosion, or like you're seeing in this image, if the soil is on a slope and the clear cutting happened on a slope, that's going to make it more susceptible to erosion as well. That will help to contribute to this idea of desertification. This is basically like turning soil into this dry, almost sand-like consistency that basically nothing grows in. And desertification happens as a result of no water and high amounts of erosion. And so clear cutting can start to contribute to the process of desertification occurring within soil. You might have a higher amount of water evaporation, especially as that soil begins to undergo desertification. It's going to be able to absorb the water less or allow that water to infiltrate and percolate less. So as a result, evaporation is going to increase, and it's going to leave you with a much drier, firmer soil. Of course, because of the lack of photosynthesis and sequestering of carbon, we may see more air pollution, which will contribute to more of a contributor to climate change. We may also see a decrease of infiltration. I just talked about that, less water actually making its way through the soil as a result of that soil undergoing desertification. We may see a decrease in soil formation. Now remember, you've got less organic material being added to your soil. No leaves are dropping, no animals are living here. So we're not seeing that organic matter cycle through. That humus layer that helps to contribute to the organic layer of soil no longer exists. So we're going to see a decrease in soil quality and soil formation as a result of that top layer basically not existing anymore. You also see a decrease in transpiration or evapotranspiration because you no longer have all of those trees to contribute to transpiration. So this is going to play a role in the actual water cycle. And then I already mentioned this, but a decrease in photosynthesis and carbon sequestering. Now let's take a look at the impacts of clear cutting on an aquatic ecosystem. So of course, if we eliminate all of that forest and all of the trees that are sitting there, that's going to increase our chances of runoff. That means all of those nutrients or pollutants that were sitting on the surface of that soil are going to much more easily run off, and then maybe unintentionally run off into a nearby water source. We talked about watersheds, so eventually they'll all sort of end up in the same place. This is going to lead to an increase in eutrophication, which we've talked about. Excess nutrients create algal blooms, which lead to hypoxic conditions for aquatic species. So that, of course, in turn would lead to a loss of habitat and biodiversity. It could also lead to an increase in turbidity. Turbidity is the cloudiness of water or the amount of sediments that are sitting within the water. So as erosion occurs and those loose sediments are coming down the side of that mountain or down the side of that hill, they may end up in water, and the turbidity or the cloudiness of the water is going to increase. That's going to decrease the amount of primary productivity because less sunlight is going to be able to infiltrate through into that cloudy water. So less primary productivity, that means it can support less species. It's also going to be a decrease in the albedo because the water has become darker. It's going to absorb more sunlight. It's going to become warmer. Increases in water temperature generally correlate to less or a lower level in dissolved oxygen. We'll talk about that correlation here in a minute, but it leads to less dissolved oxygen being present in water. And as you know from your eco columns, a lower amount of dissolved oxygen means that less things are able to survive. So you'd see a decrease in the amount of biodiversity or the amount of living things that could be supported within that waterway. All of this again from Clearcutting. So what are some ways, this is the last slide by the way, what are some ways that we can make forestry more sustainable? So instead of clear cutting, what are some options? And so sustainable forestry is really just defined as a collection of methods that attempt to mitigate the human impact of harvesting trees and using forest resources. So one of the most common ones is something called selective cutting, and that's actually what this image shows you. So instead of going through and cutting down every single tree, you are going to cut down, say, every 2 trees. And the reason this helps is because it doesn't totally eliminate the shade that's normally present. It doesn't totally eliminate everything that's growing in the soil. It eliminates like all of the trees being all the exact same age. It allows for some niches and habitats to still be available. So it really kind of eliminates all the negatives of clear cutting. The reason we don't do this more often is because it's much more challenging and it's not as economical. So it's harder to go through and like pick and choose which trees you want. It's harder to get machinery through there and load them up. It's just not as simple of a task. It ends up costing more money to do it. However, in the long term, it does save money because you're not having to wait for a forest to like fully come back in order to go back and cut more if you need to. And you'll have different stages of trees, so you'll constantly have something to be able to cut down. But up front, it can be kind of a pain. So that's one option. Reforestation or replanting, of course, after you cut down any trees, you should replant them so that they have the opportunity to come back. Buying and using timber that is sustainably sourced. So this would mainly be trees that have been selectively cut, or like the type of cutting has been monitored, so it didn't come from a forest that was clear cut. That way you're preventing the purchasing of products from clear-cut forests. Reusing wood or recycling wood that's already been cut down. So instead of purchasing more wood, using wood that's no longer in use, or timber that is no longer in use, and reusing that before you go down and cut more. And then another one is prescribed burns. So intentionally going in and doing very small burns. This can lessen the effects of natural forest fires. So when we do have like a really big natural forest fire and it burns everything down and we lose everything, if we do a prescribed burn, which is small burns, maybe annually or every 3 or 4 years, to try to eliminate some of that dead biomass that sits on the forest floor. This will also allow us to keep forests somewhat healthier on our own terms, and allow us to continue to use them sustainably. Okay, I think that's it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in class. Thanks.